Hey everybody, welcome to our session, The Impact of Privacy on Access Control. This is sponsored by BCD International. My name is Forrest and I'm the technology lead for security for Jacobs Engineering. We've got a great panel to walk you through various privacy aspects. I wanted to share kind of a small portion of my journey with privacy. I've been a security engineer for about 30 years. And I happen to live in a city, a pretty liberal city that has some pretty strong privacy laws enacted. I live in Portland, Oregon. And so it's always made me think, you know, we have this conflict with what I do sometimes for a living and yet privacy. And it really caused me to want to know more about this. And as Sal has told me, there doesn't necessarily need to be a conflict. So we're going to explore that further. Kathleen, can I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Turn this on. Hi, I'm Kathleen Carroll. I know some of you in the room. It's nice to see some of the familiar faces again. I currently chair the Security Industry Association Data Privacy Advisory Board. I am semi-retired. I started a little consulting business, and I mostly consult on the intersection of security, technology, and privacy. I've been in the security industry for longer than I care to admit. And I'm not a lawyer, so don't ask me legal questions.
Sal.
Okay, so I'm Sal D'Agostino with some sort of lovely residence there. Right? So
I turned mine off. No.
Who knows? All right, so so I'll admit I've been doing this for 40 years, and I've gone through a series of companies in those years, 18 of which were at a company called Computer Recognition Systems, which was one of the earlier machine vision companies. We put license plate readers in a tunnel in London in 1979, facial recognition system in Heathrow in 1985. So I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and because all the surveillance work that we were always been involved in, we always like to let people know that this is surveillance and we're going to be taking their pictures. So if you drive through the toll booth and you didn't pay the toll, you knew we were going to do something. And it was some like early lessons from that about if you're going to be deploying systems which are doing surveillance, you need to be transparent about it. You need to let people know up front. You need to be engaged. You need to be proactive. Where you get in trouble is when people find out about surveillance after the fact. I have a company now called IDmachines, and I also, for a while, served as the president and chairman of the board of something called the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, which was something that President Obama started with the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, and actually, as part of this presentation, you're going to see some of the stuff that we developed during that time. So thank you. Glad to be here. Sorry about the noise.
And Robert.
Awesome. Bobby Prostko, and Deputy General Counsel for IP and Cybersecurity and Chief Privacy Officer at Allegion. I'm also principal at Allegion Ventures, which is Allegion's $50 million corporate venture fund where we invest in startups that are helping our seamless access strategy that we're doing. And so I work with our different product management teams, engineering teams related to cybersecurity, and privacy, making sure that our products, adhere to those different things around the world, different laws that are coming up. And we're going to be talking about some of those privacy laws and probably touching upon some of the cybersecurity laws too that we're seeing crop up here in recent years. There's been a lot of activity, so looking forward to it.
Fantastic. So let me talk a little bit about the ground rules. So first of all, if you got a cell phone, please mute it. You've been told that before. Also, we want to keep this really interactive, so we've had some poll questions that we've sent out. I'm going to share the results of those, and we can talk about that. We also had from the WOVA app some additional submitted questions, so we want to go through those. But as we talk, this is the gold standard here. So as we talk, please jump in, ask any questions that you might have, and we'll do our best to address them. Some of the topics that we want to cover, as I mentioned, we do want to cover the poll questions. I think they were very interesting, and I'm curious to know a little bit more about the background of some of you who responded to the poll questions. We'll talk about what we're calling a privacy timeline. So if you think about privacy from the very beginning elements and some of the laws in privacy down through today, what are some of the major developments in privacy, and how are those important? We'll talk a little bit, then we'll shift into something that's starting to get us into what's called privacy by design. How can we incorporate privacy in an appropriate manner into our projects and into our designs? And the spur to that are a couple of audience questions. We've been talking about that, together, but we also got audience questions about that. So it's perfect segue. We'll talk about privacy standards that relate to design and some of the work that all of you do. Then we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about technology. So, we're all technologists. We all deal with technology. And so how does technology play a role in privacy? What are some, what they call privacy enhancing technologies? We'll explore that a little bit. We'll look at the social implications of privacy, and then the future of privacy. And then as we go through all of these, please jump out with any questions you might have, and we'll do our best to address them. So we submitted 3 poll questions through the WOVA app. The first question, how many of you in the audience deal with privacy concerns in your daily work? And if so, are you aware of the standards and guidelines or any ISO standards that relate to privacy? Are you familiar with privacy engineering and how it's used? So the first one, poll question number 1, how many of you in the audience deal with privacy concerns in your daily work? Well, we had 34 responses. 76% of those were yes. So most of you do deal with privacy in your day-to-day work. About a quarter of you don't.
But who said no? Did
Yeah.
anybody in this room say no?
And so, let's stop and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a curious answer if you're in the security business to say your work isn't involved with privacy, since every database that's ever been built is full of personally identifiable information. So,
What was the context if you said yes? Is it like the names and people's names and that kind of stuff, or it had to do with like facial recognition and video, or
good question.
which?
Yeah.
Like, what was the context if you said yes, or both? Yeah, all of that.
Are you dealing with privacy because you're bringing it up, or is your customer, your client, bringing it up to you?
Or you're not dealing with it.
Or are you not dealing
I
with
would
it?
say on the sales side, rarely are we asked about privacy and how we engage or comply with privacy. It's really almost at that external level. You don't hear about that.
Interesting.
Gentlemen?
I know the last few projects from the consultant side, all of our documentation's been going through the client attorney, so everything becomes attorney-client privilege, and they're keeping it private that way.
Well,
It's
right.
not fun,
That's
it's hard to get
transparency.
communication.
Yeah, that's.
Well,
So-
also from a design standpoint, we try to make sure we define what a camera is supposed to view, so that we're looking at doorways as opposed to people necessarily, and trying to deal with those things and understand where the database resides, and is it in a secure location, and who has access to it, that stuff.
Yeah. Well, so Sal, tell us your story. You had to do some work for a municipality, I believe, and looking at their camera views and some of the things that you found in your work.
Yeah, so not unlike you, Forrest, I live in a town that's a little progressive when it comes to things. So Brookline, Massachusetts actually banned facial recognition on a town, and actually also set up a town what's called military type equipment and surveillance committee. So we actually have a committee in the town that I serve on, which reviews all the technology used in the town, both from a police force, military perspective, as well as surveillance. And surveillance relates not only to the surveillance cameras themselves, but other surveillance technologies that might be employed, particularly in the school system. What I found was that, the town had about 300 cameras. There were no signs. Even the signs that were even the cameras that were in the school had no notice of surveillance of children, which, oops. And it's not like, and the point is that, I mean, this is a really progressive town that really wants to try to do the right thing, but basically no one had ever come up with anything that says this is what we have as a policy, right? They're just getting to the cyber piece of it, beginning to do a pretty good job of that, but the privacy stuff wasn't even on the timeline. So, yeah, so we found out all sorts of interesting things, and different different departments have their own surveillance systems, right? So not like any company that acquires stuff over time. The town acquires stuff over time, so they've got a whole mix of stuff from analog and VR, and so it was really quite an interesting exercise, quite frankly, and I'm continuing to do that, and that's also evolving into policy for private citizens and how they should be doing the same things you're thinking about, Lorna, right? So if you've got a camera that you've got for whatever reason, you don't put it in your neighbor's bedroom. All right.
I think one of the things that I thought was interesting about that also, Sal, was you mentioned that at some time, maybe 15 years ago, there was a purpose for each camera and a defined view, but over time that evolved and some of the things changed.
Well, I mean, in one example, one of the ones I was going through, cameras are replaced because a lot of this stuff is done on a state contract. There's mandatory maintenance of the latest versions of things, right? So when a camera gets old, it gets replaced. Now, in a couple of cases, the camera location was effectively the same because the pole was there, but the building wasn't the same anymore. But they put the camera right back where the old, put the new camera where the old camera was, and didn't even bother to check stuff. And nor does once a camera gets set up, is it ever taken down again? Right? So they just seem to last forever, right? So no one reevaluates purpose and justification for it. It's like you did it once, and this is the whole idea of a privacy timeline or privacy life cycle, because like any of the systems we provide have those kinds of things in play.
Yeah.
Great. Let's move to the second poll question. So now, for the yes answers, if you deal with privacy in your work, are you aware of any ISO standards or other standards that affect privacy? And so this was about kind of a 50-50 split, yes and no. And so again, if anybody happened to answer this question either way, curious to hear what you're aware of, what you use, what you know, or maybe what you don't know. Anybody remember answering this question in the poll?
Anybody? Can anybody answer yes in the room now?
It's big with GDPR, those kind of things.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, that'd be
Okay,
one.
right, yeah.
But that's more regulation than standard.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So, I mean, there's something called the NIST privacy framework, for one, right, which
Yeah.
is the equivalent of the cybersecurity framework, which everybody's probably heard of.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's an obvious one. And then, I mean, we've got references, but the ISO 29100, unlike many ISO standards, is an open framework, so that's free for everybody. So those would be, and then there's one other one that comes up later. But those are just a couple of examples of things that are generally available for references to everyone, as well as the privacy by design and other things that we're going to get into here later.
And so don't worry about missing these numbers. We're going to give you, we're going to say them again, and then at the very end, we're going to have a recap list of some standards.
I think there are 50 links in the presentation by the time we're done. So,
But it's a good thing you can view it online after the fact, right? Pause it when it comes to the...
So the third poll question is, are you familiar with what privacy engineering is and how it's used? And this is one, Robert, that you helped develop. And most people know, 63% know, but a solid group said yes. So anybody here happen to answer that question? Looks like a lot of the heavy app users are in other sessions possibly, but
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, privacy engineering is kind of a newer term. There's a book out written by the chief privacy officer, I think the former one at Cisco, called the Privacy Engineering Manifesto.
it's a really good book.
Yeah, it is, and it gets into essentially making sure that when you're doing like product development, that your privacy policies sync up with the requirements for that product, and you're putting in assurances into those products and solutions and controls to make sure that you're using data appropriately, you're using the privacy by design principles and putting them into the product during development, and all these kind of things as you're going through it, right? And you're really having a person dedicated, kind of walking all the way through product development, instead of kind of as a, sometimes like, legal or compliance is like a last step, like, hey, are we good to go and launch? Yes, and you get kind of a check mark. Here, it's really like all the way through, helping, working with the engineering team from like the beginning, the inception of that development life cycle, or working the whole way through it and always with it. So it's kind of a newer area in the last several years. You might have seen it. I think it's going to kind of be here to stay as we're, more and more laws are coming into effect, and it's becoming a bigger piece of society.
In fact, a manufacturer that I worked with invited me into the engineering meetings when they were designing products, and actually added, they had gates as, a product had to pass through, and one of those gates became a privacy gate, and then you had to, before the product was released, they had to adhere to what, according, based on what you're saying too, the policies and procedures and such, right? And then following the concept of privacy by design, which I think we're going to explain. Okay.
Yeah. And getting that done up front is like, to your point, right? It's like privacy shouldn't be something that you worry about when you make sure you met your data breach requirements, right? It should be something that maybe gets in the design process a little earlier. Right.
Exactly.
And the cost of bolting on something to a hardware solution after the fact would be astronomical and not as effective, right? So
Completely true.
and a lot of times it's because then liability issues have arisen, or someone has complained, and so then you have to go back and redo an installation or something to comply with the privacy requirements. Not a good thing.
So I guess one of the things that would be interesting is to hear how members of the panel define privacy.
Let's do it.
I think that's an excellent question.
Are we all on the same plane?
I don't think we are. I think that we are so individual as human beings that each of us have a different definition of privacy. I cannot conceive of a single definition that would encompass everything. Some people, they don't really care about a lot of stuff, right? For me, it's like, and this is just a personal definition, when I'm in my home, I want to know that my privacy is sacred. When I'm in a public place, I understand I'm in a public place. And so, I guess there are different categories of privacy folks, right? So there's the privacy absolutist who says privacy above everything, right? And then there's the privacy realist, which I fit into, which is like, okay, there are checks and balances, there are different things, right? And then there's the privacy like, oh, what the heck, I don't care, right? So I think, a lot of people might fall in that center category, but their definition might be way different from what mine is.
So relative to product development, what do you advise your clients to look at from a privacy standpoint?
For product development, when you're talking about, and I'm not an engineer, but what I say is when you're designing a product, does it have encryption? Does it include, all those technological things? But that's not my bailiwick. That's Sal. Sal can talk to that in terms of, but for me, I talk to my clients more from a policy regulatory level to say, okay, there's GDPR, okay, that's the big gorilla in the room, but then 3 states in the United States, Colorado, Virginia, and California have GDPR-like laws. There are about 15 states right now who are proposing GDPR-like laws. There is the Uniform Law Commission, which has been successful in developing laws that are adopted by a lot of states, and in some cases by all 50 states, so that folks who are, manufacturers, whoever, consultants are not dealing with 50 different state laws. There's a uniform law. They just finalized that hoping to get states to say, okay, this is the one law, right? But that's where I stand. Sal can talk more, and then I'm sure Robert can to the technical aspects of it. But encryption is huge, right?
Yeah, I mean, but I actually start with the human aspects of it, right? So I mean, the technical stuff you can go through, and there's lots of ways to do that, and you should be doing all of them. And a lot of technical things are security things that just happen to be driven by privacy requirements. But for me, it's trust, right? So I think privacy is actually a state of trust where you don't have to have your radar on high alert, right? So you're basically in a situation in which the conditions are as expected. And I just finished a EU grant in which we developed this protocol, something called privacy as expected. So like some people will say, there's no realistic expectation of privacy. Okay, fine, but if it were the case, what does that look like? And then what you find out is when you look at that, it's basically people are comfortable on their own with what they're about to do. And so somehow they trust themselves, they trust the environment, they trust other people that they're involved with. So for me, privacy is a better measure of trust.
So for me, I mean, as an attorney and whatnot, I take a kind of more formalistic approach, and it's kind of borne out like in, really even in like the U.S. Constitution, right? And you'll see it in, I think, in the coming slides in the timeline. And I separate privacy from data security. And so privacy is really a human right. And you'll see that in all the case law from the Supreme Court. And it really starts from like the law article from, I think it's from Brandeis, called The Right to Privacy, right? And that's kind of the underlying stuff from like, here in the United States for all sorts of different pieces of like our constitutional rights. So, and it's not unlimited, right? There are limits to it, especially when you go outside of your house. Like when you're inside your house, you have a lot more, your right to privacy is much stronger than like, let's say when you're gonna walk down on the river walk, right? People can take pictures of you and do all sorts of stuff. So that's that kind of balance, right, that we have in our society.
But your expectation on the Riverwalk is that people will take.
What's your expectation of privacy, right?
Right.
It depends on that.
But
That's where that distinction is you have a right to privacy, and you still, depending on what it is, right? But like encryption, these other things, these are like ways to protect people's privacy. So your question about like on the product side, those aren't necessarily privacy things. Those are the ways we protect people's privacy. So like at my job, like when we're doing like new products or like for our clouds or whatever it may be, it's like, okay, well, how are we going to make sure that, this data isn't going to get, whatever, something's not going to happen to it? Well, we use encryption, right? Or we're going to not collect as much data because we're going to do a data minimalization, principle or something like that. And that's kind of getting more into the cyber side or the data security side, and it's not necessarily privacy. Yep.
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but
Go ahead.
You're equating a legalistic viewpoint as it is a human right. You're equating it to it's a liberty. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and you can look at these things from a business. I mean, we use something called bolts, right? So we look at things from a business and operational, legal, technical, and social perspective, right? And so whenever you're talking about something like privacy, to your point as well, Kathleen, each of those silos, each of those layers, I don't want to call them silos,
yeah,
has different inputs and outputs from a privacy perspective. And then as an organization, how do you do something that covers all of that stuff?
And don't forget, I think that people's definition of privacy changes over time. So Robert mentioned Robert Brandeis, who wrote, Right to Privacy back in 1918. Do you know what triggered that? New technology, and the new technology was a camera. Camera. And Sal said, now you go on the Riverwalk, if somebody takes your picture, it's no big deal. But back then, that was huge, and that's what triggered.
Well, and I think it was actually taking pictures. It was like taking pictures of like younger women just like walking around outside, like in public, right?
Right.
And people were disturbed by that, right? Like
right.
Initially.
And
then it became either the bedroom or for marketing purposes.
Right.
And those were where you could then go south. Right.
But again, like that was 1918, right? So the definition of privacy, I don't think people are that inflamed by cameras anymore. You know, like I'm talking about a camera on the street where, you know, you're on the Riverwalk and, you know, your friends get a picture taken, right? And other people happen to be in the background. You're not going to have people raising, you know, an alarm.
Yeah, they'd have a hard time at Disneyland.
Well, perfect segue. So let's talk, moving from the poll questions, now let's talk about the timeline. So maybe,
Yeah.
Sal, you can bring us in.
Okay.
We'll do this one first, and just walk us through some of the significant developments. And Kathleen and Robert, as you see something, just pop in with things that are notable to you.
Yeah, so I mean, the whole idea is that these things are rights. So where do the rights show up? So, you know, start with the U.S. Constitution. And then the actual legal right to privacy is Brandeis, Harvard Law Review. And then you get the FTC, and then now you've got an enforcement mechanism, right? So this for me is like, before HIPAA, this is pre-HIPAA, this is pre-Euro kinds of stuff, right? So, yeah, and you've got some social stuff. I mean, I threw some social stuff in here too with Maslow's hierarchy needs, which is may or may not be the right thing, but a lot of people thought about it in the course of thinking about privacy. Yeah, I put a few social things in this timeline as well, so like 1984 and whether that began to get people thinking about surveillance a little differently, right? Because to your point, it changes over time, and that changes over time based on your own perspective, but what's going on in society as well. And then, you know, from a torts perspective, you'll know this better than I, Bobby, but right, so the ability to have a tort, basically to sue someone for someone not respecting your privacy, comes from, I guess, Posner's 4 different kinds of torts.
Yeah.
I mean, help me out here.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
My wife's the lawyer, I'm not.
So you're, yeah.
Please go.
No, the other, yeah, that's right. And I mean, the other thing I was just going to quickly point out is like on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, that came right after, obviously, World War II, right, and the atrocities of the Nazis. To me, I guess one takeaway is like, you know, here are like a difference of like how much they kind of, obviously with GDPR, that they kind of, how much like privacy means to them right over there. And I think, to me at least, some of it you kind of see of like what that society did back like during World War II, right? And to me it seems like a foundation for like why that's so important, of why now like medical records and everything else, they're so locked down and so they don't want to give away anything related to their, you know, person to anybody, to the government, right? Because they're like, well, wait, the government went and like took people away, right? And like did the worst ever. And sometimes I think we're a little more like, yeah, okay, I don't, even myself, I'm kind of like, I don't, yeah, okay, take my picture, or hey, my stuff is out there. But here, that was like a big kind of piece of it too, is doing the Declaration of Human Rights. And then the cases there, the Supreme Court cases are all like kind of big ones. From 1960 to 1970, you see there. And a lot of those, like some of those had to do with like police surveillance, and I think even like technologies like being able to look into a house, like even infrared, right?
Well,
Yeah.
Griswold,
and IR
right?
and stuff.
Griswold was
Wiretapping,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff, right?
wiretapping.
Griswold v. Connecticut.
Contraceptives,
Yeah.
right? It was like
Yeah.
whether or not
Yeah.
you needed to know whether or not someone was on contraceptive,
Yeah.
and that wasn't, not necessarily something, that wasn't a need to know.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're moving
And
ahead.
then this is probably a little bit more relevant today, right? So, yeah, EU Data Protection Directive, HIPAA, COPA. I mean, these are all things that we now really get to deal with today. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, just from a legal perspective. And then the E-Government Act brought in a lot of privacy stuff as well, particularly on requirements for the federal government. So the federal government actually gets out there, 20 years ago, in saying that as part of your deployments, you need to do an impact assessment of your information. So doing a privacy impact assessment became a requirement across the federal government, and now 20 years later, it's sort of becoming de facto best practice.
Right.
Is that before or after the Chinese hack and took all the?
No, this was before.
Yeah.
It
all
was
the
in
data from the cleared people?
But-
Yeah,
but-
no, that's, I mean, yeah. Thank you for,
Yeah.
thank you for bringing up a really fun, yeah.
but
The million of us that were.
Like for federal contracts, they actually, in some federal contracts, they make privacy requirements that they're in the contract. You cannot sell into the government unless your product or your service meets the privacy requirements in the contract, which I find fascinating. A lot of people don't read down through the contract to see.
I mean, the other thing that I put up here was 9/11 as kind of a trigger point, right? 'Cause certainly from a surveillance perspective, the
Yeah,
number of
Patriot Act.
the number of surveillance cameras that have been sold after 9/11 have gone through the roof, right? So
Right.
there are certain societal events that sort of had this big increase in surveillance, and in fact, the E-Government Act and some of the acts after the Patriot Act and all those other things, you know, those were in reaction to 9/11. And then you have a whole, and then GDPR finally kicks in, states that you were mentioning, Kathleen,
Yeah.
kicking in, California, facial recognition bans. And then I put George Floyd out there just as like the contrary to 9/11, right? So if 9/11 swung it one way, so the whole George Floyd summer, Black Lives Matter thing has created sort of an opposite reaction to surveillance in general. And so, you know, so there are these societal things that we need to take into account. That's why I said, okay, so but the question mark is the pendulum swinging back? Does anybody feel that there's more of a need for this, or you know, or is this just me trying to have a social historical perspective of privacy?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay,
One thing, there's like a great link here, though. The EDP video monitoring guidance and the link that's associated with that, I strongly recommend anybody who's deploying camera systems to take a look at that. That is absolutely the best practice that's out there in the world. And as a consultant, if you want specs to go to, get that hyperlink and go to that document.
Yeah.
It's really good.
All right, fantastic. So we're going to kind of shift into, we're going to start talking about a term called privacy by design. And so, you know, nicely, we actually got from, again, the WOVA app, we got 2 questions from the greater audience about, hey, you know, what kind of regulations should I be paying attention to? What are some tools that I can use? So let's talk about that. So one of the terms that we will describe to you, and I'm just going to very quickly breeze through some of this, but then this is a good meaty discussion, is privacy by design. And as you see, there's 7 principles. Essentially, you're looking forward. You're not reacting. You're proactive. You're not preventing. You're preventing. You're not remedial. You don't have to make a choice for privacy. It's a default setting. It's something that happens automatically as a default. It's something that should be embedded into your design, not a bolt-on. Something that Sal and I have been talking about is it's not a zero-sum, like if I have more privacy, the rest of you have less. It's a positive sum from privacy being enhanced.
And it's the same for security as well, right?
Yeah.
So I like doing this whenever I talk. Please, somebody tell me where privacy hurts security, right? If anybody thinks that they're at odds, give me an example, and I'd be glad to see if in fact there's something I've missed.
So
I always say you can't have one without the other, either way,
Maybe
right?
one example is, and I'm curious if there's a way to thread this needle, but there's an overwhelming pushback, I feel like, of video surveillance and privacy concerns in that, but that video is a very rich sensor for the sake of knowledge for the system to do good things.
Sure.
And obviously that data could be ephemeral, it could be kept totally at the edge. It doesn't have to impact privacy, but there's a perception that if there's video, then there's a privacy concern. I'm curious to, get your take on that.
Yes.
I just want to say one thing about it being good for society. The Boston Marathon bombers were caught partly because they had so much video and they were able to identify them through the video surveillance. That to me is, when you talk about what the U.S. government's main responsibility is to keep people safe, right? And so I've always felt honored to be in the security industry because I feel that we as an industry support that main government responsibility to keep people safe, right?
Yeah, so the justification is safety in that case, right? And so safety, security, and privacy all are working together. So it really depends on whether or not the justification for the surveillance system is, in fact, is increasing safety in some way, right? You know, I mean, if it's, and then it's a question always of how you go about implementing it, right? And if you have sufficient notice, and is there, you know, and is there notification, and is there a responsibility, and is there operational privacy as well, right? I mean, that's the other thing is that, you know, a lot of stuff, the security systems get deployed, and then if someone has a privacy issue, they've got nowhere to go, right? And so that's why you then get into the situations like that, which says, wait a minute, I don't like what's going on here. And the reason that the person doesn't like what's going on here is because they don't know what's going on.
Right. They don't understand.
And so I think if you get in a situation where people know about security, then the privacy stuff gets lowered. And that's why transparency, reciprocity, and proportionality are three really important measures, right? So first is, are you transparent about the nature of the surveillance?
And not just with a notice, right? So we were talking with Lauren a little bit earlier, and if you're a consultant or an integrator and you're going to put a system in to, you know, say a multi-family dwelling, bring the stakeholders together before you put that system in. Let them know, to Sal's point, so that they understand, you know, people say, you know, oh my gosh, they're putting in cameras, they're going to spy on us. No, the cameras are going to be placed in certain places to keep you safe, to keep the bad people out, to, you know, to monitor, to make sure that everybody's safe. So I worked with Siemens years ago, and that was one of their things, their thresholds was, get the stakeholders together, make sure, right, that people understand, no, we're not spying on you, we're trying to keep you safe.
German unions? Like, if I don't know if anybody familiar, right, there's no way that you put any surveillance in an employment situation covered by German unions without the consent of the union, right? Period, full stop.
And often cases, the individual.
As well, right. Yeah, so and that's why, like, the concept of consented surveillance is something, as funny as it sounds, is really how I think it should work.
But that's in a private setting, right? You know, I mean, in an employment setting, that's a private setting. It's a very different situation when you're talking in the public setting, and, you know, it is for safety and security reasons. Well, you're not going to be able to get the consent of every passerby or whatever, but, you know, and that's where, you know, again, okay, so you can't bring the stakeholders together, but then you put signs up. You know, there's some way to notify people that this area is under surveillance, right?
So circling back to one of your comments, Sal, you said earlier, give you a situation when security and privacy don't conflict, right? Or they do conflict.
Where they do conflict. I'm interested where they do conflict.
But you're really talking about policy. You're not talking about applications, where applications conflict. You're talking about policy.
I'm happy to go into the actual applications themselves. So
I appreciate that challenge, because the one that we deal with regularly, I don't want to come with something that no one ever talks about, right? Something we deal with every day is, especially in the U.S., but all cultures, there's an expectation of privacy whenever you go into a public bathroom. Even though it's not your bathroom, it's a public bathroom, and so we never install any surveillance in there. However, we know that gives a refuge area for criminal activity.
Right.
If you want to perform crime, you know if you go into the bathroom and perform a crime, you're not going to be under video surveillance. So I would challenge that that's an application where privacy, you know, conflicts with security in that respect. Because if we did have cameras, even not in the stalls, but in the more open areas, we might be able to capture some evidence of a crime or prevent a crime in that scenario. But we don't, because of privacy, you know, overrules that.
Right. So, is that the best way to make that secure? Be the first question.
No, absolutely not.
Right.
Yeah. So that's why I said it's more of like a policy statement. I would agree.
Right.
With
Yeah.
Application statement.
I mean, and there's, I mean, you know, bathrooms, your bedroom, you know, I mean, there's those, I mean, sure, those are probably some exceptions.
Right.
Good point, Mark, right?
It is, yeah.
But I don't think we're going to see a rush.
The level of privacy there, especially in the bathroom, is what you can challenge. So in Texas, there's for school safety to prevent hazing and bullying and things like that.
Yeah.
We've got, I think it's House Bill 201 that passed, or maybe it's 203, two or 3 years ago. What it does allow is for cameras in the classrooms and in the hallways, not in the bathrooms, but what it also makes an exception for is you can record in the bathrooms. You can have
Sound.
a camera on the outside of the bathroom. So now, and in Texas, there's only one person needs to know about the recording occurring. In this case, everybody would know that it's possible to be recorded. So you're not actually recording video, but you are still recording, right?
Yes.
So that's a level of privacy that has actually been challenged by the teachers' unions.
Oh.
Not just for the classroom, but the bathrooms and sense of privacy, and parents and the PTA get involved. But for the benefit of the kids, so you talk about protections that are expected in a you know, even a local government or private school, you have those concerns. And so in Texas, here you can actually have cameras pretty much everywhere except the bathroom. Yet you can put a camera outside of the bathroom and record audio. Of what's going on in the bathroom.
And with audio analytics today, it can be in real time, so that if there's someone listening, they right, and it doesn't have to be what the words are, but it can be the inflection in the voice and such like that, or gunshot detection, those kinds of things. But that's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. How do you talk about video and it's the first principle up there, oftentimes reactive. Now you fold analytics in. I would imagine that the conversation grows exponentially now when you fold analytics in terms of what you're using and how you're using it, what you're identifying, what you're looking for.
Right.
Yeah, so automated decision making. So one of the things that needs to be done is be able to measure the privacy risk to begin with, right? So how do you know that there's a privacy risk? Any automated technology, any of these surveillance technologies elevates privacy risk, right? So if you're going to have an elevated risk, what do? You have countervailing controls, right? And so it's just like you would in any security risk assessment, you bring those into play, and then you put in place the countervailing measures. And some of those controls are things like notice, right? And other stuff. So.
Right.
As someone who's been doing that forever, I mean, really interested in letting people know. If you're going to do that, you really better let them know.
But another thing, and Sal, you mentioned it, is doing this privacy impact assessment. So, it's not just privacy by design alone, but it's looking at the actual impact of a solution that you're putting in, and think about come up with scenarios where it might affect privacy, right? So if you put it in the bathroom, well, okay, right away, but there are online templates for privacy impact assessments that are, the federal government has one, which are very easy to access, and I would recommend that for a lot of, consultants or designers or whatever, as you're looking at developing a product or, developing a solution or installing a solution, do a privacy impact assessment so you can understand, where there before you get it in there, where there might be an issue, and it might save you some heartache.
There's another area that we haven't mentioned, and that is if you're like a commercial environment and you're putting up cameras around the outside of your building, that you have to be able to mask the apartment building across the street.
Oh, right,
That's
right.
another form of privacy.
Well, that's the impact assessment, right?
But that's exactly right. That's where that comes. It really is important to be able to do that, because then you're going to look at it holistically as opposed to, just, okay, I'm putting a camera here. But, if you step back and you look at it holistically, you're going to say, well, if I put the camera here, I'm going to catch the people going in and out of the condo development next to,
Or look in their windows.
Yeah, I've got hundreds of cameras that I got to block stuff out on in the town. I mean, that's an example.
I think our power ran out up here at the podium, but
Can I ask a question then?
Oh, absolutely.
To take advantage of the power outage? So, is there talking about like AI and analytics? There are two famous nation states that are very, very famous that are isolating race and ethnicity. So individually from all three, because your backgrounds are so different, what do you think that becomes when you have a metadata tag that then tags somebody's ethnicity in the video, and how that relates to privacy? When does that become a private thing? When does that metadata in that tag, how does that get affected?
What nation states? China and Russia?
No, in Israel.
And
Where
Israel.
they identify an ethnicity.
Okay.
And then they tag that ethnicity to where they have political people that come up and follow up with those human
Okay.
beings.
Well, that's, I mean, in my opinion, that's privacy invasive, and that takes me back to World War II and the issues around that, where, you know, you had to fill out identification cards and you had to wear a yellow star, and I mean, all these horrible things, right? If you're going to do that, to me, that gives me chills. That's my personal opinion.
But even though that gives you chills based on your background, what do you do about that? Is that followed up by law? Is that followed up by discussion? Is that worth looking into?
Well, so if I were a citizen of Israel and I learned about that, absolutely. I would bring it before the Knesset, or however they pronounce that, and I would say, you know, this is an issue. I don't. So I go back to when I first started in the privacy arena back in 2005. It all had to do with physical access control and RFID technology used in physical access control. What happened is they put a physical access control system into a school. They did not tell the parents that they were doing it. They said nothing. Then the ACLU got involved. It became a big deal. Out of that, 27 states introduced legislation to ban the use of RFID technology in schools, or for whatever reason. So as a personal, and I attended the school session earlier, as citizens, I think we have a right and a responsibility to speak up if we see. Now, I don't know how open Israel is. I know in China, if you speak up, so for example, I'm reading a book about the pandemic. There were Chinese scientists and doctors who spoke up about the pandemic. They were imprisoned because they spoke up about what they knew was real. So, right, it's all context dependent and situational dependent. That's my opinion.
And I think it's, from my perspective, it isn't just Israel as a country, but also I understand China does have cameras that can detect minority
That's what I'm
ethnicities.
referring to. And I'm not saying that, those are just in the news, so
Yeah.
that's my opinion.
Right.
But that's what they're used just to identify ethnicities to address it at that level.
I mean, you can fight those things as citizens if you raise your voice.
But how do you handle that with privacy? As you have those metadata,
Oh.
those tags, now how do you, who gets access to those tags?
Yeah.
Who gets to see what those tags are?
Well, so let's talk about that. So
Yeah.
privacy enhancing technologies and using, obscure data. What are some of those techniques, Bobby, that
Well,
you
I mean,
might work with?
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess the thing is, in these countries that you're talking about, I mean, the laws, they just don't have laws that apply to those things, right? Or even in the United States, I'm not sure.
Barely.
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe, it might not be illegal, right? So that's part of the thing is it just isn't. Now, if you're in Europe doing that, that would put you into like the highest risk category.
I guess just to clarify, I'm really not talking about around the world, and it's really more what do we do here in the U.S. We have a constitution. We have inalienable.
So this is what.
rights.
So to me,
So
I
how
get.
do we learn from that, and how do we apply?
Well, I
here
think
in
it
the
comes
States?
back to like I think it comes back to like the discussion around like almost like the lower level like discussion around like the Facebook. The more, you know what I mean? Like that's like kind of the advanced stuff happening around like tagging like people's ethnicity on cameras, right? There's no regulations around like there's these discussions around like Facebook and what they're doing, right? But on the stuff that's going on around the internet, it's unregulated, right? So I guess the question is should it be? How should it be? How do you do those kinds of things?
That's kind of what I was asking you.
I don't know. It's really difficult to do, right? Because different people have viewpoints. Because there's for every one of those, because like on the content, of speech, because it's difficult, right? When you're looking at that, when you try to regulate the content of speech, that specifically around like the Facebook one, it's very difficult to do that, right? To write that in like on the Supreme Court cases, when you look at it from like a con law perspective, it's difficult to write laws around that kind of stuff. It's not easy. And so like here, there's probably somebody can come up with some kind of medical thing. I don't know, maybe there is or maybe there isn't around why you might want to try to classify people or try and identify for like a medical research issue or like identifying moles or I don't know what it is or you know what I mean, or trying to find diseases or hey, you know what I mean, like I'm Irish and so I'm going to be predisposed to or something else, right? And so why do we want to ban all facial, you know what I mean, like identifying that. So it's a difficult thing to just outright ban it. So I think that's my guess is like that's why it's going to be difficult.
So it's going to boil down to government
Right.
in those cases,
It
right?
is.
And so hopefully, government and industry as a whole, right? Because what one can easily follow the other. To your point, it's like if there are no laws, then what do you say, counsel? Can I do this? There's no reason. Nothing says you can't. And then you have to answer that question that way, right? And so that becomes tricky to actually get somebody to change something. But I think if as an industry we could understand that privacy can be a service, and that it actually can raise the level of security that we're providing. That as a model, a social credit system is not what we want as a country. What we would like to have is technology that works for us, not against us. So all those things are actually some of these design principles that are fading away can actually help along those lines, right? And again, that these things do not have to be at loggerheads at the end of the day. But yeah, how do you get the Israeli government not to be using tools that hack your iPhone? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard if that's.
But we don't have standards like around I think around like certain like uses of like machine learning and like facial recognition. So like you've seen certain of these.
But not that as much as the results. What are the tags?
How do you
protect
but
tags?
not even that. But like you've seen like in the news, like there have been like certain like facial recognition systems that have had like misidentified certain groups of people, and they make them like and so you have those kind of things. So there's not like there's different, and you have these kind of things, and then you have when you don't have standards out there or you have these bad systems, then you have cities like different people have been talking about making their own rules, and you have this patchwork of stuff.
I think that's one of the incidental consequences of that. Is I don't think they care about facial recognition. I think they care more about those levels of identification. Like if you can start, doing that, because I do know that those laws that you first referenced when you came out, that author who wrote that law, that was his concern, was what you were referring to, where an animal came up for a human being, and that was their justification. It was actually written by those groups that were concerned with that, that tagging.
And to Robert's point about how difficult this is, the U.S. Congress has been trying to pass a federal privacy law for years.
Yeah.
And and I'm very proud of industry. I testified before Congress on this, but industry and SIA, the Security Industry Association, has been very active in working with the folks on the Hill to understand, because what you don't understand, and so when they talk about banning facial recognition, they're not understanding what the unintended consequences of doing that are. So when you get in a room with a bunch of senators and representatives and you try to talk to them about what the core matter is, to your point, well, the core matter is the metadata. What do you do with that, right? Well, they're not technologists, and so it's very difficult, and it's also difficult because often you're not meeting with the senator or representative, you're meeting with their staff, and their staff are 25-year-olds or 27-year-olds, right? It's an issue. It's a real issue. But I firmly believe, and one of the things I always say is get involved. The security industry. We have a data privacy advisory board. Sal's on it with me. Rob, you're on it with me too, right? Yeah. So we're all. So get involved. Learn these things and then spread the word. Like Sal, get it out there. So with your customers, with your colleagues, or whatever. And that's how we'll affect change.
Back on the topic of technology and privacy, I'm curious if there's good examples in our industry or maybe guidelines of differential privacy and how to leverage that.
Can you tell me what you mean?
So I think the classic thing, and I'm by no far an expert in this area, you saw it in the news, it was like a flash in the pan that, well, Apple takes a differential privacy approach to, gather information from anonymized data, rather than, right, the Android or Google approach, so that's very much you're the product, right? And so they were kind of shown as, hey, that's the right way to do things, but then I never heard anything about that in any other industry, any other application.
So that's one of the privacy enhancing technologies. So, I mean, essentially with with differential privacy, you're adding noise to the data. So they collect maybe like the data that you have like on your Apple Watch, and instead of sending all the data that would maybe be able to identify you or re-identify you up in like iCloud, they add some noise to it or only send some of the data up to iCloud. So then that way they can do analytics to it and combine it with other data sets in iCloud and be able to kind of use that data. It's usable for them, but it's not enough for them to be able to re-identify you, right? And so that's kind of a really key piece there. So hopefully other companies and stuff like that can find use cases for using like differential privacy, and you can kind of tune that also. Like some of the equation, right? It's a math equation of how much your noise kind of you're adding into those data sets or you're pulling in there. But it's a good way of doing it so that you're not just taking all of the data out of there, and subsequently, like in case you have a data breach or something, you're exposing then sensitive data, and especially around something like the iWatch, right, or the Apple Watch, right, where it's people's health data, right? It's in their heart rate or how much they're running or where they've been, their GPS location. You don't want to be doing that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a key piece there where they're using it on that one in particular. And maybe there are like use cases here, like in this, in this industry, especially around access control. Maybe people can do it.
Yeah, I mean, but the medical arena, that's differential privacy is critical, right? Because they want the data, but they don't want to know who it's coming from, right? But they need that data to analyze, like, so for example, during COVID, well, it's still COVID, but I mean, the idea of being able to get from an Apple Watch what people's temperature is or whatever it is could show clusters of where the virus is emerging or whatever. So, but you don't want to identify particular people. But you would like to have the medical community would like to have that data that says, this community is experiencing, a widespread rise in temperature, your body temperature, whatever, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, and in those same cases, though, you want to make sure that you're just you've got a legal purpose and the justification for it, right? So if you're going to start collecting emotion information, like some people do, in kiosks. There are these ad kiosks that are also got facial recognition that measure your response to the ad, right? So, where's the transparency around that? Where's the risk? Where's the information about sharing? So there's all this stuff that you can do in combination with differential privacy that makes that work. But any of the technological fixes usually have to have a few partners in the room in order for there to be a party.
And some of these too, like pseudonymization, are kind of critical, like especially for like GDPR.
It's the next slide, actually.
Is it?
Yeah.
Some of these other ones.
There you go.
Will actually help you, with either GDPR or even with like U.S. data breach laws. Like if you encrypted the data and then if the data is taken but the key isn't taken with it, it's in a lot of the states, it's not considered a data breach then. Under GDPR, if you're using like pseudo-anonymization, it's maybe then not considered, a lot of the kind of regulations around it then don't apply. So there's a lot of things you can do if you're designing your systems and the way you're collecting data and using it. If you're careful and not collecting in certain data fields or applying some of these technologies, you can help yourself a lot in reducing your risk and exposure, especially like in the case of like a data breach and whatnot.
So Sal, maybe walk us through this. Give us a little introduction to what we're seeing here.
Yeah, so this is the organization I referred to earlier, is this identity ecosystem framework that we came up with, actually published about 3 years ago or so. It's actually got 45 principles. It covers usability, security, usability, privacy, security, and interoperability. And when you're doing design requirements, I think it's good to take them in that order as well. So if stuff's not usable, forget it. And then consider the privacy requirements, and then the security to support that, and then hopefully there's some interoperability at the end of the day, right? So UPSI is the acronym that we came up with. And and there are 45 of them in total. There are 15 security, 15 privacy, and then like 8 or 7 for the other 2. Data minimization's rule 1. Yeah, I use the Marie Kondo analogy. I don't know if anybody in this room actually sort of follows. It doesn't look like that kind of crowd. Oh, there we go. There we go. So it's, I mean, if you have something and it doesn't give you joy, let it go. Right. So it's the whole declutter approach to life. And so data minimization is Marie Kondo for security professionals. And your younger employees will love that analogy. Purpose limitation is exactly what I was talking about before. If you've got something which is to provide some surveillance for a particular purpose, if you start then saying, oh, well, then maybe I've got this other data too that we can grow our business with, watch out, right? So that, again, so that's definitely route 2. Attribute minimization is also like only as much data as you need. And so if like all you need is an identifier, or I mean, from an access control perspective, I could use an example, right? So in order to get through a door, you really don't need to know who it is. You just need to know whether or not the person has the right to go through that door. And if they've got a credential that has effectively that right on that credential, then all you have to know is that they've actually got a valid credential and they can walk right through. So you could actually do access control without any identity. You just need to have the proper role, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Wait, I'm going to challenge you on that. What if somebody stole my card?
If someone stole your,
Single-factor authentication.
yeah, if someone stole your card, then you may want to, depending on what you're going through, you may want a second factor that's associated with it, right? So, right, so multi-factor authentication will address the loss. But just in terms of we were only talking about the attribute minimization.
I know,
no, this is great. I mean, it's exactly why I wanted to take this perspective, because I want to get pushed around. So credential limitations, number 4. It's like don't lose your credential. Don't issue more than you need. You go to the front desk. How many keys would you like? Give me 6.
Right.
And spread them around and put the number of your room number on them. It's like you wouldn't want to do that. Which is also like the data aggregation risk. Like putting your room number on your card, on your room key, is a data aggregation. That's the perfect example of data aggregation risk.
Right.
Usage.
I know. I couldn't
I use your hand because someone else is there. Usage notice. Notice to me is we did it at. I have a company in the UK which is called Open Consent. We did an analysis of 140 different countries' privacy rules. Notice is the one thing everywhere. So if you want something that works, no matter what the law is, all of those laws are going to require notice, full stop. So you can really just sort of start there. User, I actually don't like the word user. It's like there's an asymmetry to the term, but I've gotten smarter since we put these together. But can people actually be in control of what's going to take place, and particularly from a consent perspective, right? So the online experience is not user control. Maybe we could have one that is. Sharing elevates risk. So anytime you share it with someone and a third party gets information, you just raise your risk profile.
User data control. I mean, that's kind of like all of us have experienced it online when you sign up for something. You look at terms and conditions and it's 40 pages long. That's the kind of thing most people just play to go. And they're giving up.
I think we should repeat that because I couldn't hear.
Yeah, so for some of the softer questions, we're going to repeat it. So
Yeah.
the example was, you've got this software app that you're loading and there's like 40 screens full of small print. Are you really going to read all that or not? And so, there's an element about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's not only an element of that, but the idea that terms and conditions are the basis of a privacy agreement is also a little upside down too.
Yeah.
So though I'm sure you can craft some excellent.
They still legally work, and so people do it. Some of the privacy regulations around the world have kind of like required that people make them easier to understand and then try to simplify them. And I think companies are trying to simplify them and doing that type of stuff. So you're kind of seeing that. I agree that the software licenses, yeah, they still are complex, but there's a lot of talk around that area for sure. You know what I mean? About like, can it be somehow, make it something that's more uniform and stuff. I think that's a long shot and far away, because everybody's products and solutions are doing something different, so there's going to have to be differentiation and stuff. And so
the bottom line is, the question is, do you want to use this app or not?
Right, but
If the answer is yes, you agree to all of this, and if the answer is no, you don't get to use it.
Yeah. Well, what we try to talk about is notice of risk, and then proof of notice, right? And so if you can somehow manage to convey that, but I'm not sure that these agreements necessarily convey a notice of risk, right?
Yeah,
They do in terms of the text, but not from a. And so this goes back to privacy as a human thing.
Right.
And so how do you create a user experience? Because I started with usability.
Well, and you also don't want it. Well, I mean, I guess another key thing though with like some of these laws, like with GDPR, there's different bases for being able to use the data. So consent is just one.
Right.
And
what
like
it
another
says,
one
yeah.
is like another key one is like legitimate purpose. So some of the stuff like when you're doing around like health data collection, maybe, especially around maybe like employees, you don't want to ask for consent. You want it to be, we're going to be collecting that data on legitimate purpose, because if you're asking based on consent, then to like Sal's point, everybody's point, the employee or whoever it is, that the person can reject their consent. Well, wait, I need that data forever, right? Like, and you can't reject your consent. I'm going to be collecting it under a legitimate purpose, and I'll be, we're going to have that forever in this relationship. So some of them you have to be really careful up front and decide which purpose you're actually collecting the data on, and whether it's going to be consent or something else.
Right.
And making sure you stick your guns, because you're not supposed to also be able to, you can't say, hey, we're collecting on our consent. Oh wait, nope, forget that. Switching over to legitimate purpose and start changing out your different things like that.
Right, and to Robert's point, and there are in a lot of these laws, there are law enforcement exemptions and there are security exemptions. So, from that perspective, I think it's important to be familiar with, I mean, these laws can be like pages and pages, right? But you can zero in on those sections that say, so that you understand from a security implementation what the regulations apply to yours, whether you do have an exemption, whether the client would have an exemption, however that would work. But it goes to, that's one of the things that SIA has been very active in doing. And when I would testify before Congress on like I've been to a lot of states and testified, and one of the things that you try to bring out is that you have to understand that some security applications, as we've been talking about, are critical to safety, and so they need to have some sort of an exemption, because it's not realistic to expect to ask for permission every time to get consent.
Well, the eGov Act of 2002 set all that up, right?
Right.
But to your point, Bobby, what I would say is that if you could do consent by default is an option, in other words, if it works to use consent by default, then you should. If for some reason it's not consent by default, then you go to the other justifications and purposes.
Okay.
I'm
I'm
not sure. I'm not sure.
So we got about 10 minutes, and I want to, kind of like pull the audience. So we got some good nuggets that we could talk about, but one of the potential topics is standards. What standards should a consultant be aware of and use? That's one potential topic. Another potential topic is, there might be new opportunities for consultants in assisting clients with their privacy concerns. Another potential topic is, what does the future hold, within privacy? So audience, we got, like I said, about 10 minutes. Any of those potential interest areas, or do you have some other topics before we wrap up?
Okay, good.
Yeah.
The services, offering privacy services?
Yeah. So that one I'm going to direct to you, Sal. So you intrigued me with this, hey, you know what? If you're an entrepreneur, which I know you are, there's a world of opportunity right now in, helping to navigate privacy.
Yeah, surveillance notice, Mark, is an area that's absolutely ripe for this. The old school surveillance sign that says area under surveillance is kind of a joke, right? So what we've actually developed in our ongoing entrepreneurial mode is the idea of, actually saw the Chinese did a really great one, and so they had this notice that told you everything that was going to be done to you. Of course, because they were the government, they could get away with it, right? And so, but what they had was, they had a QR code, and they told you about the area that you're going to run into, and the QR code took you to the surveillance operator, and you could then interact directly with that surveillance operator. So I looked at this and said, wow, this is an opportunity for surveillance, privacy-related surveillance services. So I think it starts with better notice, and then it is a service around registering who the surveillance operator is, as well as the privacy controller. Because like in a lot of the GDPR stuff, you've got to identify the controller, but you're not really identifying the operator of the system. And maybe they're the same person, but sort of understanding who sits in those roles, and identifying those roles, and then providing services for the people in those roles, I think is the opportunity. And sir, I think you were...
Yeah, it's interesting you're mentioning the signage. I worked in a global company, and they wanted to put the same type of signage externally in an Eastern European office that included my cell phone number as a is, part of the data privacy laws for Europeans, private data. But they were absolutely fine with putting that on. My question relates more to number 10 up here. People really opting out of this policy set. I know legal in the past has taken a stance where all the employees are going to opt in, and they'll be instructed about it, informed about it, but they've got to opt out. In Europe, are they seeing a trend where they can't do that anymore? That they have to opt in? Because I've been in this scenario before with Germany where one individual did not want to opt in or opt out. They were more instructed to do, and we weren't able to bring video recording online.
I don't know. I'm not a German attorney. It gets. I will say. I know it is complicated because there's works councils, and then there's specific. So it's not even like a GDPR issue. So I was talking with people last night. They were asking me some specific, questions around video surveillance in Germany that they were trying to install. So there's a GDPR element, but then there's German privacy law on top of it.
Right.
And then you have works councils, right? Mixed in there, and then they all have to, and then so then depending if you have a works council at your location that you're talking about, then they have to vote and approve it. So it is. I don't know specifically about on that answer if just one person can block it. To be honest on that,
there's an interesting example of a Swedish facial recognition case in which basically they gave notice to everybody in the school, but and what effectively said, if your kid's going to come into school, sign here. We're going to use facial recognition. If you don't sign here, your kid won't come to school. Everybody signed. It actually was turned. It was found in violation because there really wasn't an option to decline, right? So, but most of those are come from sort of the online as opposed to the security world. But it's interesting to me to actually find examples of that.
So,
right.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing I know, like in some of the stuff, like in Germany, there's like with workers. This is like in the worker context. I believe it's that if you're going to be doing like employee surveillance, then that's when like the stuff kicks in about that they have to like approve, right? And so that which is separate from like regular GDPR collection of data, where you can do like legitimate purpose because we need to, we need your data for like employment reasons. If you're going to do surveillance of employees, like what you're describing, then all of a sudden there's separate German law that applies, right?
It includes up to them walking in the front door, not necessarily inside.
Right, yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of, yeah, it gets really complicated when you get over there, so I would hire local counsel to do that. Yeah, in Germany to help you, advise you on that, yeah.
All right, we're going to bring it on home. So we got about 2 minutes, so we got about 1 minute. So Kathleen, can you walk us through? So we've got some additional resources and
Right.
some different organizations listed. Take us through some of this, please.
Okay. The Future of Privacy Forum is based out of Washington, D.C. It is one of the privacy organizations that is actually business friendly. And looks at, they've done a lot on facial recognition, but they look at privacy with a broad lens, right? And they take in what matters for businesses, and not just like the ACLU is all about the consumer or the end user or whatever. So they have a lot of really good information, a lot of reports. Download is free, so I like that one. The FTC has a lot, if you're a small business, they have a lot of resources for small businesses. The FTC scares me from a privacy perspective, because there's a law right now before Congress that would give the FTC the right to make rules around privacy. And that would mean if this law passes, the FTC will do rulemaking. It'll be open for comment. However, it'll be a 51st state, because it's not going to preempt what happens in the state. So not a good thing. That's an aside. The International Association of Privacy Professionals, I've been a member for a long time. That's an interesting story if you talk about the timeline and the development of privacy. I joined the IAPP in 2005. They had 700 members. Today they have about 3,500 members. So you can, and then they're mostly companies, the corporate members. And again, they are very, they look at it from a business
Amazing
perspective.
resource. Yeah.
Right, wonderful resources. You know what's not up there is Security Industry Association. We have some resources, right? Yeah, come on. Right, and then NIST, of course, has lots of standards around all this. But Sal, you talked to the ISO, because
Yeah, so the international price, 29100 is open. The other two are, I think, useful things just from a design perspective. The Privacy by Design we showed you. There's a link actually to that doc, which fortunately that is publicly available. That's in the deck. The consent by design is actually something that I'm working on, and I think I got that. It's supposed to be it's 7560, not 650. So I had a typo I need to correct. And that's an evolving standard that's currently in. It's almost the last draft of it. So it's a standard that's going to come out and clarify a lot of the. Basically, it creates the concept of a consent record and a consent receipt, both of which I think are very powerful tools for implementing the kinds of services you were talking about. And I'd be happy to have a longer conversation about what's involved in that spec. And then, NIST obviously is a privacy framework and plenty of other fun stuff. But the Security Industry Association has put out a code of conduct, and we're in the process of, and we actually put an early version of a code of practice out there as well. And we'll definitely modify the slides so we can get those references into this table. And it's something we've both been working on. And again, with the idea that if you can sort of create common practice across the industry in an area where it's kind of easy to do better, that maybe we can help.
All right. Hey, let's give a big hand to our panelists. Thank you very much.